Hello and welcome to Hardfire Media Liberal Conversations. This is a series of screen media programs we are doing to discuss current events and to help us get us through this unique time of unprecedented state exercise of power in certain places. The idea for this series comes from classical liberalism, which is based on free speech, freedom of religion, equal rights under law, and a robust private sphere. My name is Cameron Weber. I'm an economist and historian and the producer of Hardfire Media. We've had about 20 of these discussions since the studio is closed, and we've been holding it on Zoom since the national emergency, which is continuing under the new president, of March 2020. We should note that we are 20 months into an emergency, which was supposed to last 3 weeks while we all get herd immunity and flatten the curve. The state never lets a good crisis go to waste, and it remains to be seen to what extent we will recover our freedoms of movement and association. For example, here in New York City, the city is requiring vax passports to enter certain private locations, the first of its kind in the United States. Other jurisdictions are following. Along with the curtailing of the freedom of movement, we are seeing unprecedented federal government spending to address the lockdowns. This, even though the economic recession only lasted 2 months and ended in April 2020. And this is from the people who officially established business cycle dating, the National Bureau for Economic Research. Right, Francisco? Created by Wesley Mitchell, I think. We should note that even prior to today's unprecedented government spending, the Government Accountability Office, GAO, has been warning that US government spending is unsustainable, yet neither Team Red nor Team Blue are doing much about it. Now I would like our guests to identify themselves, say hello to our viewers, and say why you are interested in talking about this topic. Why don't we start with our newest guest, Suraj Jaswal. Tell us who you are. Welcome to the show, and nice to see you.
Hi, my name is Suraj Jaswal. I'm a resident of Queens, Jackson Heights in New York City, and I study MBA finance, and past 20 years or so I have been working in environmental consulting industry too, but I still manage finances of my company, and I'm also a management professional. So I'm very curious and interested in both topics discussed today, the debt, national debt, and of course COVID.
Right. And I learned of Suraj through, Suraj is running for city council, District 25 in Queens. And I looked him up on the website, on his website, suraj25.com, and saw that he was interested in fiscal accountability. And so that's why I thought he might be a good person to join us. And next we've got Gary Marshall. Welcome to the show, Gary.
Thanks, Cameron. My name is Gary Marshall. As you said, I'm a public finance researcher, and I reside in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. My take on the public debt is very different from what many people view it as. I see it as a combination of it is a problem, but it's not the biggest problem, and I think that. We may get into that in a little bit, but it goes to a fundamental flaw in our understanding of public finance.
Very good. Yes. Gary has been a Hardfire participant for 10, 12 years. What did we figure that out?
Well, it was, many years ago, 13 years, I think.
First one, right. And we did one on Government Without Taxes, which I think is one of the most popular Hardfire shows on YouTube, Government Without Taxes. And so next we've got Dr. Francisco Aldape. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Cameron. I'm not a real doctor, but I like economics. Thank you for inviting me, and everyone. Look forward to our conversation today. So I, like Cameron was saying, I studied economics like around the time we had the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. So those were interesting times. It almost seems like ages ago with all that has happened, right?
Yeah.
But so I'm also very interested in these topics of public debt, environmental concerns. So thanks again for the invitation, and looking forward to our conversation.
And you're also a college professor, right?
Oh, yes. So I'm teaching also students. As Gary is saying, it's very important to have a good understanding of many of the problems that we have in today's society, right? Especially for young people. So I'm trying my best to, guide them in a certain and, safe and and reasonable sense to understand some of the big issues that we have to address, right?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And I should also say, Francisco, when he became a professor, my mom asked, "Why do you want to be a college professor?" And he said, "Because you don't really know something unless you teach it." So these conversations are also a way for us to learn some things as well. Yeah, exactly. So thank you for participating in today's discussion. First, before we get into my specific research, I'm going to be sharing some graphics. Let's hear from our discussants on this basic point. Do you think the U.S. government has a debt problem? Yes or no? Why or why not? So why don't we do it? Yeah, any spontaneous comments? First come, first serve. Do we have a debt problem? Why or why not? Suraj.
Well, we do have a debt problem, and the way I see it, it looks more like wasteful spending as well. So government has been wasting a lot of funds that could have saved, and we wouldn't have this debt. And of course, the major spending has been in foreign wars that was not necessary.
Exactly.
And besides that, Social Security, Medicare, and so on. So there are not enough people now to sustain those funds, So those are some things I'm worried about.
Yeah, right. Long-term sustainability of the nation, something like that, and what our priorities are. Who wants to go next? Anyone else?
I'll try. It's Gary. So I don't see the government as having a debt issue or a debt problem. I see the government as having a spending issue. And that's where the real problem lies. I see the debt as a sideshow or a side issue. If you look at the debts, yes, they have increased, but so has government expenditures. And government, I estimate about 80 to 85% of what government spends its money on goes to waste. So that means that whether the money's taxed or borrowed, it makes really no difference. If it's taxed or borrowed, the money's going to waste. And that waste of resources is what causes the inflation that we see. So if the government were to stop taxing and to borrow all of its funds, I don't see that as a problem. I see it if they waste the money. That's the only issue that we should really be looking at.
The reason I've been studying this lately, the reason that I think that the state, even though benevolent, let's assume benevolence, but I don't know if we can do that, is wasteful because there's no residuals. The decision makers, the state spenders, don't suffer the gain or suffer the loss or make a profit from the gain. So there's really no incentives to be efficient. So Suraj and Gary say problem on the spending side, and the debt is a secondary issue. Francisco, let's hear from you. Do we have a debt problem?
No, I also don't think that we have a debt problem. And as Gary and you were saying, that maybe we just need to figure out how to make sure that government spending is channeled in the correct way, which is difficult. But I also think that probably so taking a look at the historical the way. So in one of my classes, for instance, I had with students, and there is this discussion about. So after the post-war period, right after World War II, we had more government protections and all these, so there was economic growth and so on. The question is, how are we going to be able to bring back some sense of making sure that the government helps the economy, that continues stimulating? Because I know that's, people think that, well, is that going to lead us into more problems? I don't think so, but I feel that we just need to make sure that money is spent in the So for instance, all these issues about the child tax credit, I think it's the right, approach. All this government spending, right? Instead of perhaps spending too much in the military, which is, the whole military industrial complex, probably we can do a better job in making sure that money, is channeled to the right sectors in society.
Yeah, very good. And to that, we can add the big pharma complex and the victimless crime institutionalization complex. And the list goes on and on. International war on international prohibition. And you have many, many not so good spending priorities. We can all agree on that. That's for sure. Okay, so now I'm going to share a graphic. For the 30 years I've been studying this stuff, the Government Accountability Office GAO, has consistently said that we have to address the spending side because it realizes itself on the debt side. And so here's we used to only have debt build up during the wars. And then the Great Depression is when the social welfare state came into being. And then here Francisco was mentioning the great moderation after and economic growth after World War II. And then what happens is you get the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. And then the percentage, the publicly held debt as a percentage of the economy goes up from a sustainable 50%, or that could be argued, but now up to 80%, 90%, and now it's even greater than 100%. So you had to more than 100%. And in order to join, we were talking before we went on the air, we were talking about the Euro Union, the monetary union, and you needed to have 60% or less debt to GDP to get in. And so you can see that the US wouldn't even be allowed into the Euro Union. Anybody have anything you want to say about that? I mean, so yes, there is a spending problem, which realizes itself in the debt problem.
Well, I mean, what I would just like to point out is that I don't think that what you were saying, or I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying that the public debt, the increase of the public debt had anything to do with the financial crisis. And as far as I understand, and some economists or economic historians would argue, is that it was not so much a problem of having too much debt, but it was, within the financial system, there was starting to become, like all of these, like, the whole engineering. And so to try to blame the debt causing problems. And this is why, right, like people who are constantly saying, oh, we have a debt problem, but there is not, like, the economic crisis does not happen because of that, right? So that's just my
that's true. Yeah, the economic crisis is a whole nother topic. Some say deregulation, some say increased regulation. I mean, that's a little beyond our scope today. Yeah. But really, what I think, anyway, at least is unfair, is that we are passing this debt to people who aren't born. Every person born into the USA today carries a government debt of more than $80,000 per person, and you can see the rapid rise in this debt. So this is what I think is unfair: is that politicians can spend today and pass the debt on to those yet born, and use government spending, which then equates into the debt, and not living within our means, spending today for votes today, and then passing that debt on to those yet born and those yet voting. And so you can see here's the debt per person, and here's the big buildup during the financial crisis interventions. And then here's another huge, of course, spike during today's COVID period. So I mean, you know, I'm a what's called a fiscal conservative or a classical liberal when it comes to government spending. So, you know, it's obvious where I'm coming from, but this just doesn't seem to me right to pass this debt on to people who aren't even voting and let alone yet born. So I was wondering to get your opinions on that.
Well, when you say you pass along the debt, don't forget that we're also passing along assets. So when everybody focuses on the one part of it, which is the debt issue, there is also the idea that, you know, there's inheritance, we pass along wealth and so on onto our children, and that, I think, is a lot of that is missing. So I understand governments waste an enormous amount of money. And whether it's taxed or borrowed, as I said, it doesn't really matter. That's money that isn't, I mean, you may pass along a debt, but if the money is taxed, that's wealth that's taken out of the hands of those who've, you know, earned it and conserved it. And they would pass it along to their children as well, but they can't because the government's taken it and wasted it.
You're very consistent, I have to admit. And then back to that point about, yes, we're also passing along assets. I've been reading ethics, Foundation of Ethics and Economics by Jonathan White. I think, Francisco, you might have met him at University of Richmond. He said, sure, we may be passing along debt to those yet born or voting, but they wouldn't be born if it wasn't for us. So, right. So I know I've got a hard argument when I'm presenting that, passing on the debt. But again, I approach it from a public choice economics thing, is that I just think that they're buying current votes with the expenditures, no matter how the expenditures are funded. Right.
Well, yes. And you're taking the resources of today. And this is where I get into arguments with people like Don Boudreau, because he sees this as passing the debt along. But the thing is that the resources are the resources of today. I mean, we're taking those resources and we're wasting them. If we have, you know, if government spending is increasing, we're wasting those resources. That's resources that are never passed along. The debt issue, I mean, if you look at, say, a $10,000 debt, if a debt has grown from, say, $5,000 to $10,000, I mean, in the future, all that's going to happen is if the government decides to pay the debt off, you're going to see an asset exchange. Taxpayers will lose, lenders will win. And I mean, it's to me, it's a wash in the future. As I say, I don't see it how it. To erase the debt, you get rid of an asset, which is the debt holders' bond that they hold. Plus, you get rid of a liability, which is the claim against the assets of the citizens.
But how about the debt rating? And in fact, that's what we were going to start this program when we had originally had the idea about this program, was to use the entry point of the U.S. government's debt being downgraded. Meaning, therefore, then we would have to pay more to borrow. Do you find that a problem?
Well, again, to me, it's just it's how the government spends its money. So if the government taxes the money, and let's say they want $4 trillion, and they go out and they tax $4 trillion, and they waste 80% of that money, nobody's concerned. Nobody cares. It's not really an issue. But if they go out and borrow $4 trillion and waste it, then everybody's furious, because they say, well, we've created a debt and we have no asset really to cover that debt.
So your proposal then would then put checks and balances on government spending more so than paying with taxes, because less than 50% of people in the United States actually pay federal government income taxes.
Well, it's income taxes. There's all sorts of taxes, but I as I said, it doesn't matter whether you tax or you borrow the funds. It just matters how you spend them. And if the government were to borrow the money, all of it, instead of tax, okay, that is, go cap in hand to the public will then have some control over government expenditure.
Yeah,
They'll have full control over
instead of
government.
irrational voters. But Suraj, let me ask Suraj, what is your take on current expenditures today, not living within our means, and then passing that debt on to those yet born and voting? Is that an ethical issue to you? Gary's point is good one, that if we went straight debt finance, that people might have an incentive to track expenditures more. But what do you think, just on the as-is situation? Do you think passing debt on to those yet born and voting is an ethical problem that we face?
Yes, but I see it a little differently. I believe part of the reason is also financial illiteracy among the society. And I have had a lot of college graduates, and a lot of them are financially illiterate. They take on student debt and so on, and only to regret it later. So one of the policy proposals I have been pushing for city council is to make financial literacy class mandatory in high school, because after all these elected officials are coming from the same society. So they don't even have basics of financial literacy.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is conflict of interest. When they become elected, they have to please certain their base and or lobbies or whatever special interest. So those end up spending, and public don't pay attention to it. Even in my campaign, people don't pay attention to financial issues at all. I mean, that was like my top concern: bring financial literacy, government waste. New York City Department of Homeless Services wasted $800 million in contract, and nobody blinking eye, and candidates chanting, defund the police, defund the police. I mean, how do you justify that? If money is issue, stop government waste, and same candidates have no problem collecting up to $250,000 in matching from the city government to run their vanity campaigns to get 4,000 votes out of 80,000 or 5,000 votes. So it's a deep-rooted problem, not only at federal, it's at state level, it's city level. So we have to find the root causes and bring people's attention to it from
Financial literacy. I like that. Yeah, that's good. So before we move on to that, I guess I'm the only one that is 100% arguing that I think it's unethical to pass debt on to those yet voting. That's nice to learn. So now I'd like to show you the next thing I'd like to talk about, which is the reason for the unsustainability path of the government spending. Let's look at that. Okay, so this again is from the Government Accountability Office. And here you can see this is the cumulative real growth in the nation's GDP or national income, right? The trend line for growth in the nation's income with the financial crisis, and then here's the COVID, and then they're predicting a nice rosy future. That's good. But you can see that here's the cumulative real growth in major federal health programs. That's where the reason for the unsustainability out into the future of government spending is because of the health programs. So that's what I'd like to talk about now. For example, what we have in the USA is neither a free market system nor a single payer socialist system. Would either of these be more efficient than what we have now? And we've done two previous shows on a single pay Hardfire show on a single payer system, and didn't come to a conclusion. But but do we really want the post office providing our health services? So I guess we just have 3 minutes left, and so this is the reason for it's the extension, the healthcare inflation due to the inefficiency of the United States system now. So my question, let's just talk about that until our 1 minute's up, and wrap it up. And I think that this went well, and we addressed some good issues. Thank you. Yeah, so the healthcare spending, socialist system, free market system, mixed economy, corporatism, even worse than either socialism or the free market. Let's hear from you on that. What can we do about the unsustainability of the as-is situation for healthcare in the US?
Well, I mean, I like to look at the root causes why healthcare is expensive. The reason could be, I mean, one of the reasons from what I have seen is it takes quite a long time to become a doctor.
Accreditation issues.
And in India, I have seen you can go to medical school after high school if you study some medical classes in 11th and 12th grade.
Suraj,
Here
that's
you
part
have
of
to
your
do,
campaign, right? Part of your campaign is this accreditation issue, licensing issue, occupational licensing issue. That's one of your campaign issues, right? In New York City.
so if we short, yeah, so if we shorten that time it takes to become a doctor, and maybe they don't take that much student loan, they don't have to charge so much for services. So those are some of the root causes we have to say, look into and find, and increase the number of medical schools, residencies, supply and demand, and maybe cost of healthcare may go down a bit.
1 minute.
Yeah. So we have 1 minute left, believe it or not. Francisco, Gary, how about healthcare spending?
Well, we live in under a public health care system, and it's an abomination, really. I mean, a lot of money is wasted on bureaucracies, so we certainly don't want that. The U.S. is overrun with regulations on hospitals, licensure, as you mentioned. They have your insurance system. Each state has a different system. So you've got, instead of one company operating throughout the U.S. offering one program to U.S. to the U.S. citizens, it has to go into each state and tailor its insurance plan to fit that state. So
All about insurance, not about healthcare. Francisco, tell us quick, what can we do?
I don't think I have a solution in 6 p.m. in the afternoon.
After teaching all day, probably.
No, yeah, I would just like to. I really need to learn more about this topic, so I would like to plead the fifth, or how do you say?
That's a good one. That's a good one. So,
Yeah.
thank you. I'd like to thank our guests for participating. Our director will get angry with me if I don't wrap it up. So I'd like to thank Suraj, Gary, Francisco for participating on our show today. And for those in our audience, thank you for watching Hardfire Media Liberal Conversations. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Essential, essential, essential.